was UN Assistant General Secretary for Economic Development. He was also involved in Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN. Many awards, including a 2007 Vasily Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought, all of which I got from Wikipedia, and I'm assuming it's correct. A Wikipedia entry also says that he advises the current government, which is interesting. It does say that. So you might want to distance yourself or go and correct the Wikipedia entry. But of course, last year when we had that extraordinary general election, Jomo was named to the Council of Eminent Persons. Now, depending on how we see it, and you might want to ask Jomo this or not, and he might want to answer or not, the fate of that particular council and what it was doing, and what it imagined about the new Malaysia that that became a hashtag and was touted, broadly. Now, very quickly, just to say about the reason why Jomo's here, part of the theme that we've taken up on history. Earlier in the morning, we had Rebecca E. Carl, historian of China, and many of the things to say also, I think, Jomo, you were at that lecture, we can maybe reflect on that. The other thing that really interests me is the question of intellectual histories. And as a young person, I think the first intellectual history I read was something about a man called Vincent Harding, and a book called There Is a River, and it's really about tracing an intellectual trajectory that starts with the slaving trade all into kind of antebellum and then, into more modern African-American thinking about their own condition. It was a brilliant book. There are examples of intellectual histories that the late Benedict Anderson had, Under Three Flags, tracing anarchism in Asia. I think of the Filipino historian, Ressa Mojares, Brains of the Nation, which I thought was such a brilliant book and really got me excited about the idea of intellectual histories. Now, in some sense, I want to begin with that and ask Jomo if he can do a bit of, in a kind of self-reflective mode, think about his own location in the project of thinking about the economy and society of the country we live in, Malaya, Sabah, Sarawak. Where do you locate yourself, Jomo, in that history?
Thank you very much, Sharaad, and thank you for having me at this festival. Let me suggest that we've had a recent rediscovery of some parts of colonial history, which is extremely important. I think it's very important to recognize that most nations in the world, especially in what we call the third world, the developing world, are essentially products of imperialism, of colonialism. And if we do not recognize this, the boundaries are very difficult to understand, and the societies which compose these countries are also very difficult to understand. So I come out very self-consciously from this. In a sense, I had little choice because of my names, both African names, which are my given names are both African names, which come out of the anti-colonial struggle. But I think what is particularly important is to recognize that, in a sense, this nation is a nation which is a product of imperialism and its discontents. And its discontents are not singular, but rather plural. And one has to recognize how difficult it is to build a nation. And especially what we have had in this country since the 1930s, a conscious development by the colonial authorities of divisions, of new categories of understanding. So you find, for example, in 1931 census, for the first time, you have categories such as Chinese, Malay, Indians, whereas previously you had things like, different Hokkiens and Cantonese and Hakka and so on and so forth.
Malabaris, maybe.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about Malabaris, but I can't remember the Indian categories, but you can find them in the book by Colonial Singh Sandhu, for example. And these categories are, so the Tamils were important, but not the only ones. And of course, the so-called Madras presidency of the of India was essentially one which embraced all of South India, pretty much all of South India. And so one begins to understand that, you know, the distinctions between Kelantanese and Boyan and Jawa and so on and so forth. You know, in Indonesia, nobody would consider a Javanese a Malay. But here we have created these new categories. When Rizal talks about being Malay, what he means by being Malay has got nothing to do with religion. Okay? And many Filipinos are proud of being Malay. And so the meanings of these words, although we use the same words in these different contexts, are actually quite different. And they are not only different spatially, but they're also different culturally, and more importantly, historically. So what it means to be Malay can actually mean something very different. What it means to be other. So I remember in 1980s interviewing somebody in Kelantan, and he was proudly telling me that his children had gone to study Seberang, okay? And I was wondering where they had gone. And then it turned out that one had gone to Dungun in Terengganu, and you know, Dungun was considered to be overseas, and I mean over the river at least, yeah. And likewise, the other one was in Shah Alam. So you begin to realize the sense of belonging and identification actually has changed over time. So now we have a state project which unevenly tries to make this sense. But I think a deep knowledge, or at least a widespread popular knowledge of our country is essential to forge because it is so complex. Many of the involvement of Sabah and Sarawak is a fairly recent creation from the 1960s. Before the 1960s, nobody talked about Malaysia. Malaysia was an invention. Of course, there was an Italian novelist who wrote in the 19th century and used the word Malaysia when he was talking about the Tigre de Malaysia, referring to a character, a mythical character called Sandokan. So we need to begin to understand not only the actual history, but also how different people use history in different ways to try to create a sense of belonging, a sense of national. And this is especially important because today we have this suddenly a sense of imperial and colonial nostalgia. You know, the Prime Minister of Britain celebrates how, you know, Mr. Churchill, who basically abandoned not only the colored peoples of the empire, but also the Australians and New Zealanders, not once but twice. First in World War I, Gallipoli and all that, and then again. So it's very, very important and very appropriate to think about history.
Yeah. So the question of then the economy, right, and as a substratum of the foundations for a colonial society was the subject of a study. I mean, how exactly was the economy of the colony organized and what it produced in its wake? You know, a pluralistic society, or in Furnival's world, a plural society, and so on and so forth. But for you, as a young man growing up and, you know, deciding to work in the field of economics or political economy, and maybe help us understand the distinction, what was it that excited you? Was it kind of characterizing the colonial period? Was it dealing with the struggle to build a new nation and some of the really intense contestations of that, especially culminating in the '69 riots that we celebrate 50 years of it, not celebrate, we commemorate rather, and then the kind of re-engineering of society that comes after that, right? Where were you intellectually? What is it that you felt that you wanted to participate in?
Well, my motivation for studying economics was I had this illusion that economists basically create the rules for the world. And there's this wonderful new book by a woman named Katerina Pistor from Colombia, which she calls the Code of Capital. And it's basically about how law makes, you know, so you can come to understanding the institutions of modern society through different lenses. The lens of economics, the lens of law, the lens of history, etc., etc. But coming back to why I felt that the central challenge, I was what in Malaysia would be called a pre-engineering student, okay, doing double maths in sixth form and so on and so forth. And you basically were trying to figure out in the late 1960s what to do. And then you have this traumatic event called May 69. And you begin to realize how fragile this country is and how important it is to unite around a project. So in a sense, that shaped part of my choice, but it was also the post-colonial or post-neo-colonial project which was very important for me. And a third motivation, I think, was a sense of how, as the late Tun Razak put it, you know, that the whole point of the NEP and many of the other institutions which were introduced post-69 was ostensibly about nation building, except that nation building was defined principally in terms of relations between the Chinese and the Malays. Nobody really cared very much about Sabah and Sarawak because that problem had been dealt with earlier and had to be dealt with again later. The Indians really didn't figure very significantly, and the other Bumiputra didn't figure very significantly, and so on. So, but even that relationship had to be understood, and that's why, as I studied economics, I began to realize that it was important to understand history. I think my formal education in history ended in Form 3, and I never went back to actually having a formal education, but I began to realize this its importance much more, I mean, look around you, you know, less than a kilometer away you have Fort Cornwallis. Cornwallis never even set foot in this country, right? And who was he? He was the loser. He lost to Washington in the War of American Independence. But because you still rule an empire, you can give as a consolation prize. You make him the Governor General of the East India Company, you know, and then we end up with Cornwallis. And why is this the Georgetown Literary Festival? Because King George ruled. You know, at one time we were trying to get rid of the name Georgetown, and then now it's come back in with a vengeance almost. You know.